Hello everybody, how are you going today? It is so good to see you. Yes it is, that's an absolutely true story. What do I have here on the desk in front of me today? I've got the Nikon Z50 and I have the Sony A7R III. And why have I got these two cameras? Can someone tell me the difference, the one fundamental difference between these two cameras? Okay. Look, I know there's a lot of differences, but there is one fundamental, unchangeable, unshiftable difference. Tell me now. And roll credits. And yes, you were right. That is a noisy bus. You were right. The fact of the matter is, today we are going to talk about cropped sensors versus full frame. Is there a point? Is there any point anymore to having a cropped sensor camera? Do we need it? What's the point? So let's dive into that. Firstly, there might be some people out there that go, I have no idea, Matt, what you're talking about. So we're very quickly going to expose these two sensors to the world so you can see. Let's just straight off the bat see the difference between a full frame. So there we have the Sony full frame sensor. And as we can see, it is fulfilling that mount very much so. Now let's quickly look at the Nikon. And it's a little bit dark, but you can see in there that it's a much smaller square is inside the rather epic Nikon Z mount. They call that a DX sensor. It's a DX size there on the Z50. And in essence, it's a sensor that is pretty close to being half the size of a 35mm full frame sensor. When I was first looking at digital cameras as professional digital cameras started to become a thing, which was in the very late 1990s and the early 2000s, they were ridiculously expensive. Kodak was making a sensor unit that kind of went inside an F5. It was like this tall and it was batteries and all the electronics. It was enormous, like literally you had the camera body and then this thing that was down below, which had all the electronics inside of it. This was a very, very expensive camera. And in the end, the first cameras that became available for mere mortals like myself were cameras like the Nikon D70. The Nikon D70 was a cropped sensor. It was a DX sensor camera. And to the best of my understanding, the reason that this format even existed was a fewfold. One, cost. The larger the sensor, the higher the cost. The higher the cost of the sensor, the higher the cost of the camera. I also think production yields would have been another issue. How many good quality sensors are they getting that are larger, and how many good quality sensors are they getting that are smaller? And of course, again, that affects cost. So thus, the cropped sensor camera was born. This was a camera that, in the case of here in Australia, the D70 was around $2,500 with a kit lens, which was expensive in today's terms because the value of $2,500 was probably double what it is today, but it was still affordable. At the same time, I was buying an F5 for around $5,000. So you can get the idea that it was probably about half the price of a top of the range flagship camera. It's a bit hard because we're talking about film versus digital, but you get what I'm trying to say. So in order to get digital cameras, and this was 2004, into the hands of more people, the crop sensor was the best way for the camera manufacturers to go. They could bring a camera and its body and its sensor out at a price that wasn't too eye-watering for the masses. And of course, this is the beginning of the digital tsunami that we've all witnessed over the last decade after that. Manufacturers had this DX sensor, and it then meant a whole new line of lenses. You may not know, if you're relatively new to photography, you might not know that cropped sensor lenses were not a thing for Nikon and Canon for their full frame film cameras. There was no such thing as a cropped sensor camera with film. So we slowly had more and more cameras coming out that were cropped, and then we had more and more lenses that were coming out that were cropped. I personally lived in that cropped world from 2004 to 2008. In 2005, I got the flagship Nikon D2X, which at the time was an absolutely eye-watering $9,500 here in Australia. I think it's the worst camera I've ever bought, besides a Nikon compact camera that I bought beforehand. But it was just so much money. It was cropped sensor. It couldn't shoot above about 400 ISO. Yeah, it was a massive investment. Luckily, the D3 came out in 2008. It was full frame and it changed everything. So I lived in the DX space for 4 years. I was never happy with it. For a guy that had worked in 35mm for 15 years prior to that, it just felt like, why are we kind of thinking and working and shooting and creating full frame, which is what I'd always done. And now all I can get in the Nikon space is this crop sensor camera. It's not what I want. So during that period, I only ever bought one more cropped sensor lens because I always planned to move to full frame. Canon moved to full frame quicker than Nikon, and this was pretty disturbing. This was the only time that I ever thought, you know what, I can't hang around with Nikon any longer. I love them, but we have to go full frame. That's what I want to do. And I reckon Nikon had maybe 2 or 3 months left before I was going to pull the trigger and jump ship to full frame, when fortunately they announced the D3. So DX, I believe, and please out there correct me if I'm wrong, I believe DX basically comes from the idea of making a more affordable digital camera. That's where it originated from. And when I say DX, I mean the APS-C, all the various iterations of and names, proprietary names of a cropped sensor camera. So I will say crop sensor camera from now on. I believe, to reiterate, I believe they were invented for detachable lens cameras for the purpose of making cheaper cameras. This is in the stills world. This is in the stills world, because at this point in time, when this first happened, SLRs were not shooting video. This didn't happen until the very first camera that did that was the D90, and that was a little bit later on, but that's not why Nikon and Canon and so on created the crop sensor camera. They didn't create it for any video future. They created it for cheaper cameras. So DX became a thing, and I think, I'm guessing Nikon, Canon and so on, they decided that this was a great way to make money. It was affordable. They could make things a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter because the lens diameters could shrink a little bit because it was a smaller sensor. And it created a whole ecosystem, a whole world of people that were happy to work in the cropped sensor space. And of course, then we saw some manufacturers only making crop sensor cameras, which they were definitely making smaller. They didn't even bother to entertain the idea of full frame cameras, and that created yet another sized sensor. We had micro four thirds, and a whole other paradigm began in that space. And those cameras came to light, I think, not specifically for the cheaper sensor, but I think with a strong push towards making cameras smaller and lighter. So that's the history. My question is, why? Why do we need, why do we bother to have, is it important, do you even want to have a crop sensor camera anymore? Do you need it? Now, if you're an Olympus user or a Fuji user, etc., you would say, hey man, what are you talking about? Don't stand on my toes. I love my gear, I love the size, I love the weight, I love the image quality. Absolutely right. You are totally valid in saying that and wanting that. I do wonder now though that we've created this paradigm. You could argue that photography like this, on a camera like this or a camera like this, these were originally designed around 35mm film. You could say that's what it is. So, you know, any of the crop sensor cameras, what Micro Four Thirds, APS-C, DX, whatever they are, what is that? That's not the paradigm which we originally created and worked around, all of us that have been doing this for a long time. But ultimately, this discussion of crop sensor versus full frame, doesn't it become irrelevant when at the end of the day, it's how we create and what we want to create? And the hardest part about creating is not whether you've got the money or the muscles. I like that, the money or the muscles. Have you got the money or the muscles to go larger full frame, or the money or the muscles or the choice because you want to go smaller? That's not the question. The question is, what gets you creating? What gets you walking through the forest? What gets you out at night staring at the starry sky? DX, cropped, APS-C, Micro Four Thirds, Olympus, Fuji, Canon, Nikon, Panasonic. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, does it? So in regards to photography, ultimately, my answer to this question is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as you're getting out there and creating whatever makes you happy. And the technical advantages and disadvantages are irrelevant if it fits your use case. So that's what I think in regards to crop sensors and photography. In regards to crop sensors and video, I think it's a completely different conversation. And with video, we do have some varied uses. And one use is exactly the use that I am doing right here, right now. The reality is the outcome from a cropped sensor camera when I'm shooting 4K for a situation like this, it's actually completely irrelevant as to whether the sensor is cropped or not. It's not an issue, because the standards that we require to bring to the internet or to bring to broadcast, right now 4K is the bottom line that Netflix, for example, would use, and obviously on, say, something like YouTube, 1080p, 4K, fantastic. Either of those are fine. You literally will not be able to tell what camera someone is shooting on. I could be shooting this on my Z50 or my Z6 or my Z7 or my Sony a7R III. You're pretty much not going to know. So when it comes to video, I think there is nothing to worry about. We can shoot with all sorts of different sized sensors, and as long as you can attach the glass on the front of that sensor that you want to attach, then you are largely going to get whatever sort of result you want to get. Should crop sensors still exist? Absolutely yes, they should exist for sure. Were they kind of a bit of a sidestep for cameras and camera legacy and camera hierarchy and photography and, you know, all that stuff? Absolutely it was. I do believe that it was a budgetary decision that made camera makers bring us this new format, one that we'd never really seen before. Because you could argue, you could say, oh yeah, but back in the film days we had 110 film, this was a much smaller format, etc., etc. Indeed, but that was never used for professional work, ever. It was never used for professional work, whereas crop sensor cameras are used for professional work all the time. So I just think as a final footnote to all of this, it is really interesting that the camera industry actually created a new, and I'm going to call it, I am going to very deliberately call it a new, lesser, smaller paradigm in all of these different crop sensors, yet technology and innovation has ultimately pushed this lesser sensor to, in most cases being just as useful, just as awesome, and delivering amazing results. So it's a tough philosophical question, isn't it? Are we snobs because we have to shoot full frame versus crop sensors? No, there are technical reasons why your use case might get you shooting full frame. Look, there's technical reasons why you might shoot medium format or something like the GFX 100, which sits somewhere between traditional medium format and 35mm. It all comes down to your use case. So there you go. Stick with whatever camera you've got. As usual, as we say often on this channel, it's all down to your use case, and you're going to be a photo god with whatever you've got right now. As usual, it is so good to have seen you today. It's so lovely to have had you here. If this is your first time here and you'd like to come back, please subscribe. Please share, it makes us all so much smarter. If you could please share some more, I need to get a bit smarter. And if you'd like to see almost 200 episodes right now of what I've been creating, you can just click on the Matto and Photography down here, and see you soon. All right, crop sensor.